This is a story about how my HOA nightmare turned into a full-blown criminal case. What started as petty complaints about my front yard ended with my neighbor Linda screaming threats through my door and getting arrested right on my doorstep. But let me take you back to where it all began, because sometimes the most dramatic confrontations start from the most ordinary situations. Before I tell you how Linda Thompson became the star of her own arrest video, let me paint you a picture of Maple Grove Estates. You know those neighborhoods that look like they're straight out of a real estate magazine? That's us. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and houses that all somehow look different yet exactly the same. I'm David Anderson, and I bought my home here 3 years ago. It's a beautiful 2-story Colonial with dark blue shutters and a wraparound porch that sold me the moment I saw it. My partner Emily and I had been saving for years, and when we finally found this place, it felt like hitting the jackpot. The mortgage was manageable, the schools were great, and the community seemed peaceful. Sure, there was an HOA, but the rules seemed reasonable enough on paper. Our street, Magnolia Lane, curves gently through the development, lined with mature maple trees that explode into gorgeous colors every fall. My house sits at the corner where the street bends, giving me a slightly larger lot than my neighbors. This detail becomes important later, trust me. When we first moved in, everything was picture perfect. The previous owners had maintained the property meticulously, and we were determined to keep up their standards. Our next-door neighbors, Mark and Susan Chen, welcomed us with a homemade apple pie and insider tips about the neighborhood. Just keep your grass cut and your holiday decorations tasteful, Susan had advised with a knowing smile. The HOA here can be particular. The HOA board meetings happened every first Tuesday of the month in the community center, a small but well-maintained building near the neighborhood entrance. I attended my first few meetings, where I met Barbara Wilson, our board president, a retired school principal with a passion for property values and proper procedure. She ran those meetings like a military operation, but fairly. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have such an organized community. Then there was Linda Thompson. At first, she seemed like any other neighbor, maybe a bit more interested in everyone's business than most, but nothing too concerning. She lived 3 houses down from me in a pristine white Colonial with black shutters and a perfectly manicured lawn. Her husband Robert would wave politely while washing their luxury SUV every Saturday morning. But Linda watched. She watched everything. I started noticing her particular attention to my property about 6 months after moving in. She would walk her small white poodle past my house twice daily, her pace slowing notably as she passed my front yard. Sometimes she'd stop, pull out her phone and take pictures. At the time, I assumed she was just an enthusiastic HOA member, maybe documenting good examples of property maintenance. The first HOA meeting I attended after winter revealed how wrong I was. Linda had apparently been building a detailed documentation of what she called concerning developments in the neighborhood. She stood up during the open forum, perfectly coiffed in her designer cardigan, and proceeded to present a PowerPoint. Yes, a PowerPoint, complete with photos and red circles highlighting various violations she'd observed. My property featured prominently in her presentation. According to Linda, my mailbox was approximately 2 inches taller than regulation height. My front door wreath was seasonally inappropriate. It was February 1st, and I still had a winter. A wreath up, and my newly installed landscape lighting was excessive and potentially disruptive to astronomical observation. I remember sitting there, feeling my face grow hot as she clicked through slide after slide. Barbara Wilson, to her credit, tried to maintain order as Linda's presentation sparked murmurs and eye rolls from other homeowners. "Thank you, Linda," Barbara had said firmly, cutting off the presentation halfway through. "We'll take these concerns under advisement." After the meeting, several neighbors, including John Murphy, approached me to apologize for Linda's behavior. "She does this every year," John explained, shaking his head. "Picks a few houses to fixate on. Last year it was the Martinez family's bird bath that she claimed was attracting undesirable wildlife." I tried to laugh it off, but something about Linda's intensity that night stuck with me. The way she'd presented those minor issues as if they were criminal offenses, the gleam in her eyes when she pointed out each perceived violation. It was my first real glimpse of what was to come. Little did I know this was just the beginning. Linda Thompson wasn't just another nosy neighbor. She was about to become the catalyst for a series of events that would test the limits of both HOA authority and criminal law. Remember how I mentioned Linda's PowerPoint presentation at the HOA meeting? Well, that was just her opening act. The real drama started unfolding in the weeks that followed. And looking back, I can see how each seemingly minor incident was building up to something much bigger. It began with the letters. Every few days, I'd find an official-looking envelope in my mailbox, complete with the Maple Grove Estates letterhead. At first, I opened them carefully, thinking they were important HOA announcements. Instead, they were friendly reminders about various community standards, each one signed by Linda Thompson in her role as Community Standards Observer, a title that, as I later learned, she had created for herself. The first letter focused on my mailbox. Height. Linda had apparently taken the time to measure it with a laser level, documenting that it stood exactly 3 inches above the HOA mandated height of 48 inches. The letter included 3 photos from different angles, complete with red measurement, lines drawn on them, and a highlighted excerpt from the HOA bylaws regarding mailbox specifications. I might have taken it more seriously if I hadn't installed the mailbox using the HOA's recommended contractor just 6 months earlier. When I called the contractor to verify, he confirmed what I suspected. The height was exactly to code. But Linda wasn't interested in facts that didn't fit her narrative. The letters kept coming. My garden hose wasn't properly stowed when not in use. The paint on my shutters had inconsistent weathering patterns compared to my neighbors. My weekend newspaper remained visible from the street for more than 4 hours after delivery. Each complaint was more nitpicky than the last, and each letter contained the same thinly veiled threat. Failure to address these violations may result in fines and/or legal action. My partner Emily thought I should ignore the letters. "She's clearly got too much time on her hands," she said one evening as I sorted through that day's mail, finding yet another envelope from Linda. But something about Linda's persistence made me uneasy. I'd seen her standing in front of our house, taking photos with her phone. Sometimes she'd bring out a measuring tape, documenting who knows what. The situation took an uncomfortable turn when Linda started involving other neighbors. She'd corner Susan Chen at the community mailbox, pointing at my house and speaking in hushed but animated tones. I'd see her showing her phone to Barbara Wilson after HOA meetings, presumably sharing more evidence of my violations. Some neighbors started avoiding eye contact with me during their daily walks, as if my alleged HOA infractions were somehow contagious. Robert Thompson, Linda's husband, seemed embarrassed by his wife's behavior. One Saturday morning, while Linda was at her yoga class, he approached me as I was mowing my lawn. "Look, David," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "I want you to know that I've tried talking to her about this fixation she has with your property. She's always been very passionate about community standards." I appreciated Robert's attempt at diplomacy, but his words weren't exactly reassuring. Passionate seemed like an understatement for someone who had created a detailed spreadsheet of my daily garbage can placement. Another violation, apparently. My bins were sometimes visible from the street for more than the allowed 12 hours. On collection day, the breaking point came during what I now call the Great Garden Gnome Incident. Emily's mother had given us a handcrafted garden gnome as a housewarming gift. It was a cheerful little thing, hand-painted and holding a tiny watering can. We placed it in our flower bed, partially hidden behind a hydrangea bush. According to Linda's next letter, this constituted an unauthorized lawn ornament that disrupted the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. But this time, Linda didn't just send a letter. She took it upon herself to correct the violation. I came home from work one day to find the gnome missing. At first, I thought it had fallen behind the bushes, but then I noticed a note tucked into my door frame. In Linda's now familiar handwriting, it read, "Unauthorized decorative items have been removed for the preservation of community standards. You may retrieve your property from the HOA storage facility during regular business hours." The problem: Maple Grove Estates didn't have an HOA storage facility. When I knocked on Linda's door to ask about the gnome, she answered with that same composed, slightly superior smile she always wore.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I'm simply enforcing the bylaws," she said, refusing to acknowledge whether she had taken the gnome. "Perhaps, if you spent more time reading the community guidelines and less time decorating, we wouldn't have these issues." I stood there on her porch, trying to maintain my composure. "Linda, did you take the gnome from my property?" Her smile never wavered. "I've documented 17 separate violations on your property in the past month alone. The gnome was merely the most visible example of your disregard for our community standards. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you're welcome to bring it up at the next HOA meeting." As I walked back to my house, I could feel her watching me. That's when I realized this wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. Linda Thompson had appointed herself not just the observer of community standards, but their enforcer. She had crossed a line by removing something from my property, and somehow she seemed to think she was completely justified in doing so. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of Linda's escalating behavior. The garden gnome incident would soon seem trivial compared to what was coming next. Linda Thompson was about to show everyone in Maple Grove Estates just how far she was willing to go to maintain her version of community standards. After the garden gnome incident, I decided it was time to take a more proactive approach. I couldn't just keep playing defense against Linda's increasingly aggressive behavior. The next morning, I called Barbara Wilson, our HOA board president, to formally report what had happened. Barbara's response was a mix of concern and resignation. "David, I've been getting Linda's emails about your property, about 40 of them in the last month alone. She's become quite focused on your house." She paused, and I could hear her shuffling through papers. "But taking things from your property, that's different. That's not HOA enforcement, that's theft." I scheduled a meeting with the full HOA board for the following evening. As I pulled into the community center parking lot, I noticed Linda's SUV already there. Of course, she'd caught wind of the meeting. Inside, she sat in the front row, a thick binder on her lap, her expression reminiscent of a cat that had cornered its prey. The meeting started normally enough. Barbara called us to order, and I presented my complaint about the missing gnome. I kept it factual, explaining how the decoration was well within HOA guidelines. I checked. There were no restrictions on garden gnomes as long as they weren't excessive in size or quantity. I described finding it missing and Linda's cryptic response about the non-existent HOA storage facility. Then Linda stood up. What followed was 30 minutes of the most bizarre presentation I've ever witnessed. She had created a full documentary of what she called my systematic destruction of community standards. There were time-stamped photos of my house taken at all hours, screenshots from her Ring doorbell showing when my lights were on, even satellite images from Google Earth with carefully drawn lines showing how my garden beds were asymmetrically oriented relative to the street.
Axis.
Mr. Anderson's presence in our community represents a clear and present danger to property values, she declared, clicking through to a graph showing projected home prices. His cavalier attitude toward standards, exemplified by that grotesque lawn ornament, threatens everything we've built here. The other board members looked uncomfortable. John Murphy, who'd been on the board for 10 years, finally spoke up. Linda, this seems excessive. Have you considered that your actions might be crossing some lines? Linda's response was chilling. I'm protecting our community, she said, her voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. If the board won't take action, then concerned citizens must step up. That gnome was just the beginning of what needed to be removed. The threat in her words was clear. I looked around the room, seeing the discomfort on everyone's faces. Even Robert, Linda's husband, was staring at the floor, his face red with embarrassment. Barbara tried to regain control of the meeting. Linda, the board has reviewed David's property extensively. Not only are there no actionable violations, but your removal of his property constitutes theft. We're requesting that you return the gnome immediately and cease your surveillance activities. Linda's reaction was immediate and intense. She slammed her binder shut, the sound echoing through the room. You're all blind, she shouted, jabbing her finger toward Barbara. When this neighborhood turns into a slum because of people like him, she pointed at me. Don't come crying to me. She stormed out of the meeting, leaving behind a stunned silence. Robert mumbled an apology and hurried after her. I'm simply enforcing the bylaws, she said, refusing to acknowledge whether she had taken the gnome. Perhaps if you spent more time reading the community guidelines and less time decorating, we wouldn't have these issues. I stood there on a porch, trying to maintain my composure. Linda, did you take the gnome from my property? Her smile never wavered. I've documented 17 separate violations on your property in the past month alone. The gnome was merely the most visible example of your disregard for our community standards. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you're welcome to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. As I walked back to my house, I could feel her watching me. That's when I realized this wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. Linda Thompson had appointed herself not just the observer of community standards, but their enforcer. She had crossed a line by removing something from my property, and somehow she seemed to think she was completely justified in doing so. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of Linda's escalating behavior. The garden gnome incident would soon seem trivial compared to what was coming next. Linda Thompson was about to show everyone in Maple Grove Estates just how far she was willing to go to maintain her version of community standards. After the garden gnome incident, I decided it was time to take a more proactive approach. I couldn't just keep playing defense against Linda's increasingly aggressive behavior. The next morning, I called Barbara Wilson, our HOA board president, to formally report what had happened. Barbara's response was a mix of concern and resignation. David, I've been getting Linda's emails about your property, about 40 of them in the last month alone. She's become quite focused on your house. She paused and I could hear her shuffling through papers. But taking things from your property, that's different. That's not HOA enforcement, that's theft. I scheduled a meeting with the full HOA board for the following evening. As I pulled into the community center parking lot, I noticed Linda's SUV already there. Of course, she'd caught wind of the meeting. Inside, she sat in the front row, a thick binder on her lap, her expression reminiscent of a cat that had cornered its prey. The meeting started normally enough. Barbara called us to order, and I presented my complaint about the missing gnome. I kept it factual, explaining how the decoration was well within HOA guidelines. I'd checked there were no restrictions on garden gnomes as long as they weren't excessive in size or quantity. I described finding it missing, and Linda's cryptic response about the non-existent HOA storage facility. Then Linda stood up. What followed was 30 minutes of the most bizarre presentation I've ever witnessed. She had created a full documentary of what she called my systematic destruction of community standards. There were time-stamped photos of my house taken at all hours, screenshots from her Ring doorbell showing when my lights were on, even satellite images from Google Earth with carefully drawn lines showing how my garden beds were asymmetrically oriented relative to the street axis. Mr. Anderson's presence in our community represents a clear and present danger to property values, she declared, clicking through to a graph showing projected home prices. His cavalier attitude toward standards, exemplified by that grotesque lawn ornament, threatens everything we've built here. The other board members looked uncomfortable. John Murphy, who'd been on the board for 10 years, finally spoke up. Linda, this seems excessive. Have you considered that your actions might be crossing some lines? Linda's response was chilling. I'm protecting our community, she said, her voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. If the board won't take action, then concerned citizens must step up. That gnome was just the beginning of what needed to be removed. The threat in her words was clear. I looked around the room, seeing the discomfort on everyone's faces. Even Robert, Linda's husband, was staring at the floor, his face red with embarrassment. Barbara tried to regain control of the meeting. Linda, the board has reviewed David's property extensively. Not only are there no actionable violations, but your removal of his property constitutes theft. We're requesting that you return the gnome immediately and cease your surveillance activities. Linda's reaction was immediate and intense. She slammed her binder shut, the sound echoing through the room. You're all blind, she shouted, jabbing her finger toward Barbara. When this neighborhood turns into a slum because of people like him, she pointed at me. Don't come crying to me. She stormed out of the meeting, leaving behind a stunned silence. Robert mumbled an apology and hurried after her. The rest of us sat there, processing what had just happened. Barbara finally broke the silence. David, I think you should consider filing a police report. This behavior, it's beyond the scope of HOA matters now. The next morning, I found my front yard had been reorganized. My flower beds were torn up, plants uprooted and arranged in neat piles on my lawn. A note was pinned to my door, correcting your violations since the board won't. The chaos of your landscaping has been properly sorted. You're welcome. I called the police immediately. Officer Rodriguez arrived within the hour, taking photos and notes. As he was finishing up, Linda emerged from her house, walking her poodle. She stopped in front of my yard, a satisfied smile on her face. Is there a problem, officer? She asked innocently, as if she hadn't just vandalized my property. Officer Rodriguez turned to her. Ma'am, did you have anything to do with this damage? Damage? Linda laughed. I improved it. The plantings were chaotic and violated Section 7(3) of the HOA bylaws regarding symmetrical landscape design. I simply brought it into compliance. The officer's expression hardened. Ma'am, regardless of any HOA rules, you cannot destroy someone else's property. This is vandalism, and if Mr. Anderson wants to press charges... Press charges. Linda's voice rose an octave. I am a respected member of this community. I've lived here for 15 years. He's the one destroying our property values with his... She gestured wildly at my house, seemingly at a loss for actual violations. I decided to press charges. As Officer Rodriguez explained this to Linda, her face went through a series of expressions. Shock, outrage, and finally, a kind of cold determination that made me uneasy. This isn't over. she said quietly, before turning and walking back. To her house, her poodle trotting beside her. Mark Chen, who had watched the whole scene from his driveway, came over after Linda left. "Be careful, David," he warned, when Linda got into it with the Martinez family last year over their bird bath. Their cars got mysteriously scratched. Nothing was ever proven, but I nodded, already making mental notes to install security cameras. Something told me Linda Thompson wasn't going to take this lying down. The garden gnome and the flower beds were just the beginning. She was escalating, and I had a feeling things were about to get much worse. After filing the police report about my vandalized garden, I knew I needed to protect myself. That evening, I installed a comprehensive security camera system. 4 cameras, covering every angle of my property. Emily thought I was being paranoid, but something about the look in Linda's eyes when the police were there told me this wasn't over. I wasn't wrong. The next week was deceptively quiet. Too quiet. Linda's usual twice-daily dog walks past my house stopped completely. Her SUV remained in her garage, and the only sign of life from her house was Robert leaving for work each morning, deliberately avoiding eye contact as he drove past. But then the strange things started happening. First it was my mail. Pieces would go missing, not everything, just enough to make me wonder if I was losing my mind. Then my morning newspaper would disappear before I could get to it. Small things, easily explainable but unsettling. The security cameras caught nothing. Linda was too smart for that, but I knew it was her. Call it instinct, call it paranoia. But I could feel her watching, waiting, planning her next move. It didn't take long to find out what that move would be. One morning, I woke up to find my entire front yard covered in bright pink flamingos. Not just a few. We're talking at least 50 plastic flamingos, each one carefully placed and angled to face my house. A letter was taped to my door, typed this time, but unmistakably from Linda. "Since you insist on degrading our community with unauthorized lawn ornaments, I thought I'd help you embrace your tacky aesthetic fully. Perhaps now the board will understand the gravity of the situation." I checked the security footage immediately. The cameras had been turned, not disabled, just slightly repositioned to miss the crucial angles. It must have happened gradually, over several days, so subtle I hadn't noticed in my daily footage reviews. Barbara Wilson arrived before I could even call her. She stood in my driveway, coffee cup in hand, staring at the sea of pink plastic birds. "This has gone too far," she said, shaking her head. "The board is calling an emergency meeting tonight. Linda's behavior, it's affecting the whole community now." She wasn't wrong. By mid-morning, cars were driving slowly past my house, people taking pictures of the flamingo invasion. Some neighbors stopped to help me remove them, while others watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. Mark and Susan Chen helped me bag up the flamingos, storing them in my garage as evidence. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was packed. Every chair in the community center was filled, with people standing along the walls. Linda sat in her usual front row seat, looking oddly pleased with herself. Barbara called the meeting to order, but before she could speak, Linda stood up. "I move to discuss the immediate removal of all lawn ornaments from the community," she announced, starting with the Anderson property. "Linda," Barbara's voice was firm, "this meeting isn't about lawn ornaments. It's about your behavior. The flamingos, the vandalism, the theft. It stops now." "I haven't done anything wrong," Linda replied smoothly. "I'm merely highlighting the urgent need for stricter enforcement of our community standards. If Mr. Anderson can have a garden gnome, why can't I place flamingos? The precedent he's setting." John Murphy interrupted her. "Linda, we all know you took David's gnome. You destroyed his garden. You're harassing him. This isn't about HOA rules anymore. This is about your obsession with controlling your neighbors." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. other neighbors started, standing up, sharing their own stories of Linda's harassment. Patricia Martinez described how Linda had photographed her children's birthday party, claiming the balloon decorations violated HOA guidelines. John talked about Linda measuring his grass with a ruler every Sunday morning. Linda's face grew redder with each story. Finally, she exploded. "You're all blind," she screamed, jumping to her feet. "This community is going to ruin because none of you care about standards anymore. Anderson moves in with his ugly gnome, and suddenly everything we've built is falling apart." Robert tried to calm her down, but she shrugged him off. "Don't touch me," she shrieked. "You're just as bad as they are. I saw you wave to him yesterday, fraternizing with the enemy." Barbara banged her gavel repeatedly. "Linda Thompson, as president of this board, I am serving you with an official cease and desist. Your actions have gone beyond HOA enforcement into criminal behavior. If you continue to harass any member of this community, we will take legal action." Linda went very still, the kind of still that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. She turned to me, her eyes burning with an intensity that made me instinctively step back. "You," she hissed, "you did this. You turned them all against me, but I'm not done. You think the flamingos were bad? You haven't seen anything yet. I built this community, I protected it, and I will not let you destroy it." With that, she stormed out of the meeting, leaving Robert standing there looking helpless. The room burst into conversation, but I barely heard it. Linda's threat echoed in my head, and something told me she meant every word. That night, I double-checked every lock in my house. I reviewed all my security camera footage, making sure they were properly aligned. I even parked my car in the garage instead of the driveway, something I rarely did. Emily thought I was overreacting. "She's all talk," she said as we got ready for bed. "What's she going to do, plant more flamingos?" I wasn't so sure. There had been something in Linda's eyes at that meeting, something that went beyond mere HOA obsession. This had become personal for her, and I had a feeling the flamingos were just her opening act. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a car door slam somewhere in the neighborhood. I lay there in the dark, listening intently, but nothing followed. Little did I know that sleepless night was just the beginning. Linda Thompson was about to show everyone in Maple Grove Estates exactly how far she was willing to go to protect her community. And this time, pink flamingos would be the least of our worries. The morning after the emergency HOA meeting, I woke up to relative calm. The flamingos were gone, locked safely in my garage as evidence. Linda's house appeared quiet, with all the curtains drawn. Even her husband's car was missing from the driveway, which was unusual for a weekday. I should have known the quiet wouldn't last. Around noon, I received a group email addressed to every homeowner in Maple Grove Estates. The subject line read, "Urgent Community Standards Emergency, the truth about David Anderson." What followed was a meticulously crafted 5-page document detailing every perceived violation of my property since I moved in. But this time, Linda had gone beyond simple HOA rules. She'd somehow dug into my personal life, including details about my job, my previous addresses, even my credit history, much of it fabricated or twisted to paint me in the worst possible light. "Can we trust someone with 3 late mortgage payments in their past to maintain our community standards?" she wrote. "Mr. Anderson's history of financial irresponsibility is just the tip of the iceberg." The email included photos of my house taken at various times, with red circles highlighting supposed infractions. She'd even created a timeline suggesting I was running a home-based business. I occasionally worked from home in violation of HOA rules. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing with texts from concerned neighbors. Barbara Wilson called immediately. "David, I've already contacted our HOA attorney," she said, her voice tense. "This is defamation. We're drafting a cease and desist letter right now." But Linda wasn't done. An hour later, another email arrived. This one included a scan of what she claimed was a police report from my previous address, completely fabricated, alleging noise complaints and property damage. She was trying to paint me as some kind of neighborhood menace. Mark Chen came over after seeing the emails. "This is insane," he said, showing me printed copies he'd brought. "Look at this. She's photoshopped dates on these documents. You can see where she's edited them." I was already on the phone with Officer Rodriguez, the same officer who'd responded to the Flamingo incident. He listened carefully as I explained about the emails, the false documents, and Linda's increasingly erratic behavior. "Document everything," he advised. "Forward all emails to us. This is moving into harassment territory, and with the falsified police report, she's committed fraud." While I was on the phone, Emily texted me a photo. Linda was standing in her front yard, handing out printed copies of her emails to anyone who walked by. She'd set up a kind of information station, complete, with a poster board displaying blown-up photos of my house. Robert's car was still nowhere to be seen. Later, we'd learn he'd moved in with his sister temporarily, unable to handle Linda's escalating behavior. Around 3 p.m., Barbara Wilson arrived at Linda's information station with the HOA attorney. I watched from my security cameras as they served her with the cease and desist letter. Linda's response was to rip up the document and throw the pieces in Barbara's face. "You're all complicit," she screamed, loud enough for my cameras to pick up. "This community is being invaded by people who don't respect our standards, and you're letting it happen." The attorney calmly recorded everything on his phone while Barbara tried to reason with Linda. "This has to stop," Barbara insisted. "You're harassing a resident and spreading false information. The board will have no choice but to take legal action." Linda's laugh was almost maniacal. "Legal action? I am the law in this community. I've protected these standards for 15 years. Without me, this place would be overrun with garden gnomes and flamingos and who knows what else." More neighbors had gathered to watch the confrontation. Patricia Martinez was recording everything on her phone. John Murphy stood nearby, shaking, his head in disbelief. Linda noticed her audience and seemed to grow more energized. She grabbed her poster board and marched toward my house, still screaming about community standards and invasion of property values. The crowd followed at a safe distance, many still recording. When she reached my front yard, she planted her poster board right in the middle of my lawn. "This is what we're fighting against," she announced to her unwilling audience. "Today, it's a garden gnome. Tomorrow it'll be pink houses and car repairs in the driveways. Where does it end?" Officer Rodriguez chose that moment to arrive, responding to my earlier call about the defamatory emails. He took in the scene, Linda ranting in my yard, the crowd of neighbors recording everything, Barbara and the HOA attorney standing by, with the shredded cease and desist letter. "Ma'am," he called out to Linda, "I need you to step off Mr. Anderson's property." Linda spun around to face him, her eyes wild. "Oh, so now the police are involved in the conspiracy too?" "Of course they are. Everyone's against maintaining standards. Everyone's against keeping our communities safe from people like him." She jabbed her finger toward my house. Officer Rodriguez approached her calmly. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Please step off the private property." Instead of complying, Linda grabbed her poster board and marched up to my front door. She began pounding on it with her fist. "Come out and face me, Anderson. Come out and explain to everyone why you think you're above the rules." I watched, everything from my security camera feed, already sending the live footage to the police department, as Officer Rodriguez had instructed earlier. What happened next would become legendary in Maple Grove Estates. As Linda continued pounding on my front door, Officer Rodriguez moved quickly toward her. "Ma'am, step away from the door now. This is your final warning." But Linda was beyond warnings, beyond reason. She spun around to face the growing crowd of neighbors, her face flushed with rage. Do you all want to know what he's really hiding in there? Why he won't come out and face me? I've seen him bringing in suspicious packages at night. I've documented everything. She pulled out her phone, frantically scrolling through what must have been hundreds of photos. Look, here he is at 9:43 p.m. on Tuesday carrying a box inside. And here, 11:15 p.m. last Thursday, another package. What's in those boxes, Anderson? She screamed at my door. What are you hiding from the community? The suspicious packages were just my regular Amazon deliveries, but Linda had spun them into something sinister in her mind. Officer Rodriguez reached for her arm. Ma'am, you need to step away from the door right now. Linda jerked away from him, her designer cardigan slipping off one shoulder. Don't touch me. I'm a respected member of this community. I'm trying to protect our property values. She turned back to my door, her voice rising to a shriek. You think you can hide in there forever, Anderson? I know what you're doing to our community. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, Linda reached into her purse and pulled out something that made several neighbors gasp. A set of keys. You want to know how serious this is? She announced to the crowd. I had copies made of every key in the neighborhood. For security purposes, of course. Someone has to maintain standards when the board won't do its job. She held up a key ring with what looked like dozens of keys. And now, we're going to find out exactly what Mr. Anderson is hiding. She jammed a key into my front door lock. It didn't fit. Undeterred, she tried another, then another, growing more frantic with each attempt. Linda Thompson... Officer Rodriguez's voice was sharp now. Step away from that door immediately. You can't stop me, she screamed, still trying keys. I have to protect the community. I have to maintain standards. Someone has to do it. Barbara Wilson stepped forward, her phone recording everything. Linda, you're admitting to making illegal copies of residents' keys. Do you understand what you're saying? Linda laughed, a high, unhinged sound. Illegal. Nothing I do is illegal. I'm the only one who cares about this community. The only one willing to take action. She tried another key, her hands shaking. When I find what he's hiding, you'll all thank me. That's when a second police car pulled up, responding to the calls from multiple neighbors. Officer Sarah Mitchell stepped out, quickly assessing the situation. Linda saw her and became even more agitated. Oh, perfect! More witnesses. You'll all see I was right about him. She rattled the door handle violently. Come out, Anderson. Show everyone what you're really doing in there. Officers Rodriguez and Mitchell exchanged a quick look, then moved in simultaneously. As they reached for Linda's arms, she spun around, swinging the key ring like a weapon. Don't you dare touch me. I'm protecting property values. I'm maintaining standards. In her wild gesturing, she accidentally struck Officer Mitchell in the face with the keys. Everything happened very quickly after that. Officer Rodriguez caught Linda's arms while Officer Mitchell, despite a bleeding scratch on her cheek, moved to restrain her. Linda fought them, screaming about property values and community standards, still clutching her keys and trying to reach my door. Linda Thompson, you're under arrest, Officer Rodriguez announced, managing to secure her wrists in handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. But Linda was far from silent. As they led her toward the police car, she continued her tirade. This is what happens when we let people like him in. First, it's garden gnomes, then it's illegal activities. I'm the only one who sees it, the only one brave enough to stop it. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as Linda was placed in the back of the police car, still ranting about community standards and property values. Her perfectly styled hair had come undone. Her expensive cardigan was askew, but her eyes still blazed with righteous fury. Robert's car pulled up just as they were closing the police car door. He'd been called by a concerned neighbor and rushed over from his sister's house. He stood there, watching his wife in the back of the police car, looking both embarrassed and relieved. I'm so sorry, he said to no one in particular. She's been... She hasn't been herself lately. The HOA rules, the community standards, it's all she talks about, all she thinks about. I should have done something sooner. Barbara placed a hand on his shoulder. Robert, this isn't your fault. Linda needs help, and maybe now she'll get it. As the police car drove away, with Linda's muffled shout still audible through the windows, the neighbors slowly dispersed. Some stayed to help clean up the scattered papers from Linda's information station. Others gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd witnessed. I finally opened my front door, stepping out to survey the aftermath. The key ring lay on my welcome mat, where Linda had dropped it during her arrest. At least 30 keys, all carefully labeled with house numbers. Officer Mitchell, after getting the scratch on her face cleaned up, bagged the keys as evidence. "We'll need statements from everyone," she said. "This is going to be multiple charges, attempted breaking, and entering, assault on an officer, illegal key copying." But this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Even as Linda was being driven away in the police car, none of us realized that her arrest would set off a chain of events that would expose secrets about Maple Grove Estates that even Linda, with all her surveillance and documentation, hadn't uncovered. In the immediate aftermath of Linda's arrest, Maple Grove Estates felt like a community in shock. The image of our self-appointed standards enforcer being led away in handcuffs, screaming about property values, had shaken everyone. But what happened next would shake us even more. The day after Linda's arrest, I received an unexpected visit from Detective Sarah Collins. She was investigating the case of the illegally copied keys, but something else had caught her attention. "Mr. Anderson," she said, sitting in my living room with a thick folder in her lap, "we've been looking into Mrs. Thompson's documentation, and we've found something concerning." She opened the folder, revealing hundreds of photos, notes, and detailed logs. This goes way beyond simple HOA violations. Linda, it turned out, hadn't just been documenting my supposed infractions. She'd been keeping extensive records on every house in Maple Grove Estates for years, but buried within her obsessive notes about lawn heights and paint colors was evidence of something much darker. She inadvertently documented several actual crimes, Detective Collins explained. While she was focused on mailbox heights and garden gnomes, she was unknowingly photographing and recording evidence of a sophisticated real estate fraud scheme. The detective spread out several photos on my coffee table. They showed various houses in the neighborhood, with Linda's typical red circles highlighting what she considered violations. But in the backgrounds of these photos, there were patterns that the police had noticed: strange meetings, suspicious exchanges, documents being passed between cars. Mrs. Thompson was so focused on community standards that she didn't realize what she was actually capturing, Detective Collins continued. Her detailed logs of everyone's comings and goings helped us identify a pattern we've been trying to track for months. It turned out that while Linda had been obsessing over my garden gnome, she'd unknowingly compiled evidence against a group of real estate investors who had been running a property flipping scheme through several HOA communities, including Maple Grove Estates. The next day, Barbara called an emergency community meeting. The room was packed again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Instead of tension, there was a sense of disbelief as Barbara and Detective Collins explained what had been discovered. Several properties in our community were being used as part of a larger fraud operation, Barbara explained, her voice steady but strained. These investors would buy houses under different names, artificially inflate their values through fake renovations, and then sell them at hugely marked up prices to unsuspecting buyers. The room erupted in questions. How long had this been happening? Who was involved? How had no one noticed? Detective Collins stepped forward. The scheme was sophisticated, but Mrs. Thompson's unusual level of surveillance accidentally exposed it. Her photos and notes provided us with timestamps, license plate numbers, and documentation of meetings that these individuals thought were secret. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Linda's obsession with maintaining property values had actually helped expose people who were artificially manipulating those very values. Robert Thompson sat in the back of the room, looking shell-shocked. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She talked about protecting property values constantly, but I never thought... He trailed off, shaking his head. The investigation revealed that several houses in Maple Grove Estates had been part of the scheme, including one directly across from Linda's house. While she'd been measuring grass heights with a ruler and documenting garden gnome violations, she'd also been inadvertently photographing evidence of fraudulent property inspections, fake contractors, and suspicious meetings. The level of detail in her documentation is extraordinary, Detective Collins told us. Mrs. Thompson recorded everything: dates, times, license plate numbers, descriptions of people and vehicles. She thought she was building a case against HOA violations, but she was actually building evidence for a major fraud investigation. As the detective spoke, I couldn't help but think about all those times Linda had stood in her yard, taking photos of what she claimed were violations, all those early morning and late night surveillance sessions she conducted. She'd been so focused on enforcing her vision of community standards that she'd missed the actual crimes happening right in front of her. The next few days brought a flood of investigators to Maple Grove Estates. They combed through Linda's extensive records, cross-referencing her photos and notes with their ongoing investigation. Several arrests were made, none of them residents of our community, but all connected to the property scheme. Mark Chen, who worked in real estate himself, helped explain the scope of the scheme to the rest of us. They were using HOA communities because they knew the strict standards would make it easier to hide their activities, he said. Who would question multiple contractors coming and going when everyone's always doing HOA-mandated improvements? And the revelation cast a new light on Linda's behavior. Her obsession with rules and standards, while still extreme, had inadvertently served a purpose none of us could have imagined. Her meticulous documentation of everything that happened in Maple Grove Estates had helped uncover a crime that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. Barbara called me a few days after the investigation became public. "David," she said, sounding tired, "the board has been discussing everything that's happened. We're implementing new guidelines for community documentation and surveillance. What Linda did wasn't right, but it showed us we need better oversight of what's happening in our community." I thought about the garden gnome, still missing, and the flamingos stored in my garage. They seemed trivial now compared to what had been uncovered. Linda's obsession with control and standards had driven her to criminal behavior, but it had also accidentally exposed actual criminals. Robert came to see me that weekend. He looked older somehow, worn down by everything that had happened. "I wanted you to know," he said, standing awkwardly on my porch. "I found your garden gnome in our attic." Linda had. She had a whole collection of things she'd confiscated from various neighbors over the years. I'm returning everything to their rightful owners. He handed me a box containing not just my gnome, but several other small decorative items I hadn't even realized were missing. "She really thought she was protecting everyone," he said quietly. "In her mind, every rule she enforced, every item she removed, was for the good of the community." As I watched Robert walk away, I realized that Linda's story wasn't just about an HOA Karen gone wild. It was about how someone's obsession with control and order had blindly led them to document actual chaos and crime, all while missing the bigger picture. While the fraud investigation continued to unfold in Maple Grove Estates, Linda's own legal troubles were mounting. A week after her arrest, I attended her initial court hearing, along with several other neighbors who had been subpoenaed as witnesses. The courthouse was a stark contrast to our manicured community. Inside the fluorescent-lit courtroom, Linda looked different. Gone were her designer cardigans and perfectly styled hair. She sat beside her attorney in a plain navy suit, her face drawn and pale. Robert sat in the back row, his shoulders hunched, looking anywhere but at his wife. The charges were read aloud: attempted breaking and entering, assault on a police officer, harassment, illegal reproduction of keys, theft of personal property, and stalking. But it was what came out during the proceedings that left everyone stunned. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "during the investigation of Mrs. Thompson's home, we discovered something troubling." She held up a thick binder. "This contains detailed information about every resident of Maple Grove Estates, not just their HOA violations, but personal information, credit card statements, medical records, private correspondence." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Linda had gone far beyond simply documenting violations. She'd been collecting private information about everyone in the community. The prosecutor continued. Mrs. Thompson used her position as a self-appointed community standards observer to gain access to residents' personal information. She convinced local businesses, medical offices, and service providers that she was an official HOA representative. I watched as Linda's attorney leaned over to whisper something to her, but she shook him off. Her face remained impassive, but her hands, folded in her lap, were trembling. "Furthermore," the prosecutor went on, "we found evidence that Mrs. Thompson had been entering residents' homes when they were away. The illegally copied keys weren't just for emergencies. She was conducting unauthorized inspections of people's private property." The revelations kept coming. Linda had created elaborate files on each resident, documenting everything from their daily routines to their shopping habits. She had photographs of the inside of people's homes, taken during her unauthorized inspections. She had copies of private emails, medical records, and financial documents. Barbara Wilson, sitting next to me, looked ill. "I had no idea," she whispered. "All those times she came to board meetings with concerns about residents. She was using stolen information." The judge listened intently as the prosecutor detailed how Linda had manipulated her way into people's lives, all under the guise of maintaining community standards. She had used the information she gathered to pressure residents into compliance with her interpretation of HOA rules, threatening to expose private details if they didn't cooperate. Then came the psychological evaluation. The court-appointed psychiatrist testified that Linda suffered from an obsessive disorder that had manifested in an extreme need for control and order. Her fixation on community standards had become a way to exercise that control over others. Mrs. Thompson's behavior escalated over time, the psychiatrist explained. What began as a genuine concern for maintaining property values evolved into an obsessive need to control every aspect of her community. The more control she gained, the more she needed. As the evidence mounted, I couldn't help but think about all the times Linda had seemed to know things she shouldn't have known. The comments about my work schedule, the references to Emily's medical appointments, the hints about our financial decisions. She hadn't just been watching our houses, she'd been invading every aspect of our lives. Robert's testimony was particularly painful to watch. He described how Linda's behavior had gradually changed over their 15 years in Maple Grove Estates. How she'd started keeping detailed logs of everyone's activities, how their home had slowly filled with files and photographs and evidence of violations. She turned our guest room into what she called her community standards office. He testified, his voice breaking. The walls were covered with maps of the neighborhood, with pins marking what she called areas of concern. She had surveillance schedules, detailed notes about everyone's comings and goings. I tried to tell her it wasn't right, but she said she was protecting our investment. The judge listened to all the testimony with a grave expression. When it was time for Linda to speak, she stood slowly, her attorney at her side. "I was protecting the community," she said, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "Everything I did was to maintain standards, to preserve what we built. These people say," she gestured at the courtroom, "they don't understand what it takes to maintain order, to protect property values. Someone had to do it." The judge's response was measured but firm. "Mrs. Thompson, maintaining community standards does not give you the right to violate people's privacy or break into their homes. Your actions show a disturbing pattern of criminal behavior masked as community service." Linda was sentenced to psychiatric treatment and 3 years of probation. She was barred from returning to Maple Grove Estates and prohibited from serving on any HOA board or community organization. The judge also ordered her to undergo regular counseling and to have no contact with any of her former neighbors. As Linda was led out of the courtroom, she turned to look at us one last time. Her expression was a mix of defiance and something else, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding of what she had done. After the hearing, we gathered in the courthouse lobby. Robert approached our group, looking exhausted. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "Linda. She kept recordings of everything. She had cameras hidden around the neighborhood, years of footage. The implications of this hit us all at once. Our private moments, our daily lives, all captured and catalogued by someone we thought was just an overzealous neighbor." The day after Linda's court hearing, Detective Collins called an urgent meeting at the community center. The room was packed again, but this time there was a sense of dread. We all knew we were about to find out exactly what Linda had captured in her years of secret surveillance. "Before we begin," Detective Collins announced, standing at the podium, "I want to emphasize that what we found in Mrs. Thompson's recordings has become part of several ongoing investigations. Some of what I'm about to share may be disturbing." She clicked a remote, and a timeline appeared on the screen behind her. It stretched back 7 years, the period during which Linda had been actively recording the neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson had 16 hidden cameras positioned throughout Maple Grove Estates, the detective explained. They were small, weatherproof, and strategically placed to capture maximum coverage. She also had directional microphones installed in several common areas. Barbara Wilson raised her hand. "How did we never notice these devices?" "They were professionally installed," Detective Collins replied. "Mrs. Thompson hired a security company, claiming she was the HOA president. The cameras were disguised as ordinary outdoor fixtures, landscape lights, decorative elements, even birdhouses." The detective clicked to the next slide, showing a map of camera locations. Red dots covered our community. The park, the community center, the walking trails, even the visitor parking areas. Linda had created her own surveillance network, all under the guise of community safety. While most of the footage shows ordinary daily activities, Detective Collins continued, we've identified several incidents of significant interest to law enforcement. The real estate fraud scheme we previously discovered was just the beginning. She played a series of clips. Though the quality wasn't great, we could clearly see various suspicious activities that Linda had inadvertently recorded. Drug deals. In the visitor parking lot, a car theft ring operating through our supposedly secure community. Even evidence of identity theft operations being run from one of the rental properties. Mrs. Thompson was so focused on HOA violations that she completely missed the actual criminal activities she was recording, the detective explained. She would fast forward through these incidents, looking for violations of community standards. Instead, the irony was staggering. While Linda had been obsessing over my garden gnome and other minor infractions, she'd been sitting on evidence of serious crimes. But then came the most shocking revelation. We found something else in the recordings, Detective Collins said, her expression grave. something that explains Mrs. Thompson's escalating behavior over the past year. She played another clip, this one from 6 months ago. It showed a nighttime meeting between Robert Thompson and Barbara Wilson in the community center parking lot. They were arguing about something, their voices barely picked up by the microphone. "I can't keep covering for her," Robert was saying. "She's getting worse. The files, the surveillance, the obsession with Anderson's house. It has to stop." Barbara's response was clear. "If she finds out about the board's decision, it'll destroy her. We have to handle this carefully." The room erupted in whispers. Barbara stood up, her face pale. "I can explain," she said. "The board. We had voted to remove Linda from her unofficial position. We had concerns about her mental health, about her increasing fixation on rules and violations. But before we could tell her, we discovered irregularities in the HOA's financial records." More whispers. Detective Collins held up her hand for quiet. "Mrs. Wilson has been cooperating with our investigation," she explained. "It appears that Mrs. Thompson discovered evidence of embezzlement from the HOA funds, not by Mrs. Wilson, but by a former board member who had served as treasurer. Instead of reporting it, Mrs. Thompson used this information to maintain her influence over the board." The detective clicked to another slide, showing financial records. Mrs. Thompson used this leverage to increase her unofficial authority in the community. She threatened to expose the financial misconduct unless the board allowed her to continue her enforcement activities. Robert Thompson stood up, his voice shaking. "That's why I moved out. When I found out she was blackmailing the board, I couldn't handle it anymore, but I was afraid to report it, afraid of what she might do if she felt cornered." The room fell silent as we all processed this information. Linda's obsession with community standards hadn't just been about maintaining property values, it had been about power and control. She'd used her surveillance to gather leverage over everyone, creating a web of secrets and threats that kept her in control. "There's more," Detective Collins said quietly. "We found evidence that Mrs. Thompson had been experiencing periodic breaks from reality. In her recordings, she would sometimes talk to herself, describing conspiracies against the community. She believed she was the only thing standing between Maple Grove Estates and total chaos." The detective played one final clip, Linda, alone in her home office, surrounded by files and photos, talking to her reflection in a window. "They don't understand. They can't see what's coming, the decline, the decay. Only I can stop it. Only I can maintain the standards, whatever it takes." As the clip ended, Robert buried his face in his hands. Several neighbors moved to comfort him, but most of us sat in stunned silence. The Linda we thought we knew, the annoying but seemingly rational HOA enforcer, had been hiding a much darker reality. After Detective Collins's revelations about Linda's recordings, Maple Grove Estates felt like a different place. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years now looked at each other with suspicion, wondering what secrets Linda might have captured in her surveillance files. The next bombshell dropped 3 days later when the FBI arrived. I was working from home when I noticed 2 black SUVs pull up outside the community center. Men and women in suits emerged, carrying boxes and equipment. Within hours, they had set up a temporary command center in our community room. Special Agent Marcus Chen, no relation to our neighbors Mark and Susan, called a community meeting that evening. The room was so packed that some residents had to stand along the walls. "What we're about to discuss is part of an ongoing federal investigation," he began. "Mrs. Thompson's recordings have led us to uncover something much bigger than local crime or HOA disputes." The agent explained that Linda's obsessive documentation had inadvertently exposed a sophisticated money laundering operation. The real estate fraud we'd discovered earlier was just a small part of a much larger criminal enterprise. While Mrs. Thompson was focusing on garden gnomes and mailbox heights, Agent Chen explained, she was unknowingly documenting meetings between members of an international criminal organization. They were using Maple Grove estates and other similar communities as fronts for their operations. The FBI had been investigating this organization for years, but they'd never been able to gather enough evidence until Linda's recordings surfaced. Her cameras had captured countless meetings, transactions, and conversations that the criminals thought were taking place in complete privacy. Mrs. Thompson's obsession with surveillance actually worked in law enforcement's favor. Agent Chen continued, the criminals chose this community precisely because it seemed too boring, too normal for anyone to look closely. They never imagined that an overzealous HOA member would be documenting their every move. But there was more. As the FBI dug deeper into Linda's files, they discovered something that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. Linda had known. Not initially, but over time, she had begun to piece things together. They played an audio recording from one of Linda's self-documented monologues. The community is infected. The corruption goes deeper than anyone knows, but I can't tell anyone. They wouldn't understand. I have to handle this myself. I have to maintain control. The standards are the only thing holding back the chaos. Agent Chen explained that Linda's growing awareness of the criminal activity in our community had likely contributed to her deteriorating mental state. Instead of reporting what she discovered, she seems to have channeled her anxiety into increasingly aggressive enforcement of HOA rules. It was her way of trying to maintain control as she realized how much was actually beyond her control. Robert Thompson, who had been silent throughout the meeting, suddenly spoke up. That's why she became so fixated on David's house, he said, his voice hollow. She had evidence that the criminals were using the house next door to his for their operations. She thought if she could maintain absolute control over that part of the neighborhood, she could somehow stop what was happening. Everything started making more sense. Linda's obsession with my property, her increasingly erratic behavior, her desperate need to maintain what she called community standards. She had been watching actual criminals operate in our neighborhood, but her mental state had prevented her from handling it rationally. The FBI shared more clips from Linda's recordings. We watched as she documented suspicious meetings while narrating about mailbox heights. We saw her photograph drug deals while complaining about unapproved paint colors. Her running commentary became increasingly disconnected from what her cameras were actually capturing. The tragedy here, Agent Chen said, is that Mrs. Thompson had gathered enough evidence to bring down this entire operation months ago. But by the time she understood what she was seeing, she was no longer capable of distinguishing between real threats and imagined violations of HOA rules. Barbara Wilson stood up, her face ashen. The night before her arrest, Linda came to my house. She was agitated, talking about how she needed to clean up the neighborhood. I thought she was just having another episode about community standards, but she showed me some photographs. Barbara's voice cracked. They were of actual criminal activities. I didn't believe her. I thought she was having a breakdown. The FBI agents shared more details about the criminal organization that had been operating in our community. They had chosen Maple Grove Estates specifically because of its strict HOA rules. The regular presence of contractors, landscapers, and maintenance workers provided perfect cover for their operations. While everyone was focusing on Mrs. Thompson's apparent obsession with rules and regulations, Agent Chen explained, she was the only one who noticed that something more sinister was happening. Unfortunately, her method of dealing with this knowledge only served to mask the real problem. As the meeting concluded, we all sat there trying to process this new information. Linda Thompson wasn't just a crazy HOA Karen. She was someone who had discovered genuine criminal activity in our community, but had been unable to handle that knowledge in a rational way. The next day, I received a visit from Agent Chen. He had more specific questions about my interactions with Linda. "We believe your house became a fixation for Mrs. Thompson because of its proximity to one of the organization's key properties," he explained. "In her mind, controlling your property became synonymous with controlling the criminal activity she was witnessing." The FBI's presence in Maple Grove Estates continued for weeks. Agents interviewed every resident, combed through Linda's extensive files, and set up surveillance on several properties identified in her recordings. But it was what they found in Linda's personal diary that truly revealed the extent of her unraveling. Agent Chen shared portions of the diary during a follow-up community meeting. The entries tracked Linda's gradual descent from overzealous HOA enforcer to someone struggling to maintain her grip on reality. An entry from 6 months ago read, "More suspicious activity at 1542 Maple Drive today. They think their deliveries go unnoticed, but I see everything. The board won't listen. They're too concerned about Anderson's grass being half an inch. Too long? Can't they see what's really happening? I have to maintain control. Standards are slipping, everything's slipping." As the entries progressed, Linda's writing became more erratic. Her observations about actual criminal activity became increasingly tangled with her obsession over HOA violations. 3 men in dark suits entered the house at 2 a.m., one entry read, carrying briefcases, probably more illegal transactions. "And Anderson's garden gnome is mocking me. It watches, it knows. Everything is connected. The standards are our only protection. Without them, chaos wins." The FBI had also discovered something else, a hidden room in Linda's basement, unknown, even to Robert. Behind a false wall in their storage area, Linda had created what she called her command center. The walls were covered with photographs, maps, and strings connecting various houses and residents. Mixed in with surveillance photos of actual criminals were hundreds of pictures of minor HOA violations. Mrs. Thompson's mental state appears to have deteriorated significantly as she gathered more evidence of criminal activity, Agent Chen explained. Instead of reporting what she saw, she retreated further into her role as community enforcer, apparently believing that strict adherence to HOA rules would somehow prevent the criminal enterprise from succeeding. The command center contained something else, detailed plans for what Linda called the purge. In the weeks leading up to her arrest, she had been planning a massive operation to cleanse the neighborhood. Her plans included breaking into multiple homes, removing what she called contaminating elements, everything from unapproved decorations to suspected evidence of criminal activity, and implementing what she termed total standards compliance. Robert Thompson stood up during the meeting, his voice shaking. "I found her adding to these plans late one night, talking to herself about saving the community. When I tried to reason with her, she said I was part of the decay. That's when I knew I had to leave. I couldn't watch her destroy herself anymore." The FBI shared more from Linda's final diary entries. The last one, written the morning of her arrest, was particularly disturbing. "Today is the day. The gnome must go. Anderson's resistance is proof of infiltration. Once his house is cleansed, the others will fall in line. Standards will be restored. Order will prevail. I am the last guardian, the only one who sees the truth, whatever it takes." Agent Chen explained that Linda's fixation on my house had actually prevented her from taking more drastic action against the real criminal activities she'd discovered. "In a strange way," he said, "her obsession with Mr. Anderson's property may have kept her from confronting the actual criminals directly, which could have had dangerous consequences." The investigation revealed that Linda had compiled enough evidence to bring down the entire criminal operation months ago. She had photos, videos, and detailed notes about their activities. But as her mental state deteriorated, she had become unable to separate real threats from imagined violations of community standards. The tragedy, Agent Chen said, is that Mrs. Thompson was right about many things. There were criminals operating. In your community, there was corruption and illegal activity. But her method of dealing with this knowledge only served to obscure the real problems. The FBI also discovered that Linda had been receiving anonymous threats. The criminal organization had become aware of her surveillance and had tried to warn her off. But instead of being intimidated, she had interpreted these threats as further proof that she needed to maintain stricter control over the community. "They're threatening me because they fear order," she wrote in her diary. "They fear the standards, but I won't back down. The standards are all that stand between us and total chaos." Barbara Wilson shared her own revelation during the meeting. The night before her arrest, Linda came to my house. She was agitated, more so than usual. She handed me a USB drive and said, "When the time comes, you'll know what to do with this." I didn't look at it then. I thought it was just more photos of HOA violations. But it contained evidence of everything, the money laundering, the drug deals, all of it. She knew what was happening, but she couldn't process it in a rational way. It's been 6 months since Linda Thompson was arrested in my front yard, and Maple Grove Estates has changed in ways none of us could have imagined. The FBI investigation has concluded, leading to multiple arrests and the dismantling of a major criminal enterprise. But the aftermath of Linda's actions continues to ripple through our community. Last week, I attended Linda's final court hearing. The judge had ordered a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, and the results painted a complex picture of a woman caught between reality and delusion. The prosecution and defense had reached a plea agreement that took into account both her mental state and the unexpected assistance her surveillance had provided to law enforcement. Mrs. Thompson's actions, while illegal and deeply troubling, inadvertently served the public good, the prosecutor stated. Her obsessive documentation helped bring down a criminal organization that had eluded law enforcement for years. However, her methods were criminal and caused significant harm to her neighbors. Linda sat quietly throughout the proceedings, looking smaller somehow in her prison jumpsuit. Robert was there, sitting a few rows behind her, his face a mask of grief and resignation. The judge's final ruling reflected the complicated nature of the case. Linda would serve 1 year in a psychiatric facility, followed by 5 years of supervised release and mandatory counseling. She was permanently barred from living in any HOA community or serving in any community organization. After the hearing, Robert approached me in the courthouse hallway. "There's something you should know," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "Linda left this for you. She wrote it during her first month in custody." The letter inside was written in Linda's precise handwriting. "Dear Mr. Anderson, by the time you read this, you'll know everything. About the criminals next door, about the evidence I gathered, about how I lost myself trying to maintain order in a world that was spinning out of control. I owe you an apology. You became the focus of my desperation, my need to control something, anything, in a community that I knew was being corrupted from within. Your garden gnome, your flower beds, your house. They became symbols in my mind of everything I thought I needed to protect. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of the criminal activity I was witnessing. Afraid of losing the community I'd helped build. Afraid of admitting that all my rules and standards couldn't actually keep us safe. I'm getting help now. The doctors here are helping me understand that my desire for control became an illness. That my need to maintain standards became a weapon I used against my neighbors instead of a tool to help our community. The garden gnome is in a box in my attic. along with everything else I confiscated. Robert knows where. Please return everything to their rightful owners. And if you choose to put that gnome back in your garden, know that somewhere I'm learning to be okay with that. Linda Thompson. The letter hit me hard. The Linda who wrote it seemed so different from the woman who had terrorized our neighborhood. The doctors explained that her breakdown had been building for years, fueled by the stress of witnessing criminal activity she felt powerless to stop. Maple Grove Estates is different now. The FBI investigation led to the arrest of 12 people connected to the money laundering operation. 3 houses in our community had been used as fronts for their activities. The house next door to mine, which had been central to their operation, is now owned by a young family with 2 kids. The HOA has changed too. Barbara Wilson stepped down as president, feeling she had failed to recognize the signs of both Linda's deterioration and the criminal activity in our community. The new board, led by Mark Chen, has implemented a more balanced approach to community standards. We learned valuable lessons from this experience, Mark said at his first meeting as president. Yes, community standards are important, but not at the cost of our humanity, not at the cost of turning neighbors into enemies. Robert Thompson sold their house and moved to another state to be closer to his sister. Before he left, he helped return all the items Linda had confiscated over the years. The garden gnome now sits back in my flower bed, joined by 2 pink flamingos, a reminder that sometimes it's our imperfections that make a community real. The FBI's investigation revealed that Linda's obsessive documentation had gathered evidence that will be used in prosecutions across multiple states. Her cameras had captured meetings, transactions, and conversations that provided crucial evidence against a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for years. In her own way, Mrs. Thompson was trying to protect her community. Agent Chen told me during our final interview. She saw real threats but couldn't process them in a healthy way. Instead of reporting what she saw, she retreated into an obsession with rules and control. Looking back, I can see how Linda's story is more than just a tale of an HOA Karen gone wild. It's a story about how fear can twist good intentions into harmful actions, about how the need for control can blind us to what's really important, about how sometimes the people who seem the most rigid, the most rule-obsessed, might be fighting battles we can't see. The garden gnome still sits in my flower bed, its cheerful face a reminder of everything that happened. Sometimes, when I'm working in the yard, I think about Linda, hoping she's finding peace and the help she needs. And I think about how thin the line can be between protecting what we love and destroying it in the process. Up next, check out 2 more wild neighborhood stories on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch what happens when neighbors take things too far. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to catch more incredible true stories like this one.